you can see my
Thanks, Nikki.
Okay, how's it look? No notes, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, well, welcome everyone. And like I said, I recognize a few people in the audience, and this may be something you've seen a little bit before, but hopefully I have some new information to share too. I'm not going to introduce myself again because Tim did a great job. So wanted to just share that this is a picture of the Garcia River. Beautiful place. Okay, so what I want to talk to you all about today, just as an overview of the Pacific salmonids in our local watersheds, talk about their decline and their listing under federal and state endangered species laws, why they became low in numbers to begin with. And then my focus is working on monitoring of these fish in our local watersheds. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what that project is, the methods, just give you an idea of what we do out there, and then talk about some of the recovery strategies that many of our people in the community and partners work on to try to recover these fish and improve the health of our freshwater habitat. So a few of just the key points to help you come away with that our local watersheds are home to 3 native salmon and steelhead species that are at risk of extinction. Monitoring is a really important component to understand their status. And then most climate change models are predicting that and we're seeing this, it's predicting, but it's happening now. We're going to be seeing these hydrologic changes that are going to impact our salmon in ways that I'll talk about and think about through the presentation. And then it's just an important part of doing a lot of really careful planning and having long-term vision for how we can restore these watersheds and how to move forward. So I'm just going to be talking about 3 of the 7 Pacific species of Pacific salmon that are distributed not only on our west coast, but all the way across the sea over to Russia. And what I'm showing you here now is Coho salmon distribution. The green is where they're currently distributed. The red is where they used to be, but they're extirpated. And I just want to highlight down around into this California section. I want to turn my little pointer on if I can. We're at the very southern edge of the range. So that is something where the fish are adapted to different kind of climates than they are up north. It's warmer here. We have less water. And so I wanted to just show you that. So as I go along, here's the Chinook salmon. Here's their distribution again. Same kind of distribution, a little bit wider, a little bit more truncated in some places a lot of times because of dams. And then steelhead trout are our final. There's my shared picture. It's a beautiful picture of a steelhead that Jackie's holding there. And again, there's their distribution all the way across the Pacific Ocean. And then a little different than the other 2 species in that they used to be, and there's some pretty far down south compared to our other 2 species of salmon. And so while these species, we have 3 species here and they have a really wide range, they obviously have adapted locally to different watersheds. And so they're listed under the Endangered Species Act under distinct population segments. And so they're distinct that they represent evolutionary significant units, which are populations that are substantially reproductively isolated from other populations. And they're also contributing to the ecological or genetic diversity of the species. And so when they get listed, and this is true for all vertebrate species, you may have one species, but you have different segments of the population that have different listing statuses. And so again, what we're working with here on the Mendocino Coast and part of California is the Central California Coast Coho ESU. And that's highlighted in pink here. And the blue lines are where my program does the monitoring. And I'll show you in a little bit how further extensively the monitoring goes into the different ESUs, but that's the focus where I'll be talking about information today. So they have similar life history traits, but they're adapted uniquely to the different watersheds, and that makes them unique. And then so here we have the Northern California steelhead, and the orange is the distribution for them. The one below that is actually the Central California coast steelhead. That's over into the Russian and further south. And then there's more down south as well. Again, we'll be focusing on this portion of the ESU. And then coastal Chinook salmon are our third species. They're definitely less numerous than the other two. Yeah, they're just the distribution of the coastal Chinook salmon, and they're threatened just like steelhead, whereas coho are endangered. Occasionally we do get 3 other species in some of our rivers, not enough to really monitor, but they will show up, and those are chum, sockeye, and pink. Yeah, there's a few rivers where on certain years we'll find the juveniles, and so it's not uncommon, but they're not a common species here. So salmon, why salmon, and the importance of salmon in our ecosystems. I think Tim touched on this a little bit. They really tie the ocean to the freshwater and then the terrestrial to the aquatic. When they come home, they not only carry the next generation of salmon that are going to be spawned into the rivers, but they're also carrying nutrients from the ocean. And these marine derived nutrients nourish the food webs. And these relationships have co-evolved over time. The watersheds provide rearing habitat, which has been, it's nurtured by our forests. And because we've had habitat degradation that began about 150 years ago, that really depleted the runs, we have some big holes in these important ecological food webs. Many of you are probably very familiar with our local watersheds, and we do monitoring from Usal Creek all the way down to the Garcia River. In general, they're coniferous redwood forests. Most of our watersheds, fortunately, are unregulated by flow as far as big dams. You know, there's definitely some, but a little unique in that sense compared to a lot of other places in California. The rivers are very driven by our Mediterranean climate. The peak stream flows occur in the winter and recede through spring and summer. And so therefore, a lot of our rivers have, we have rivers that will have estuaries that will actually close off to the ocean when the flows are low enough. And so that's really important for understanding migration timing for salmon and steelhead. A couple of those, we call them bar-bill estuaries, occur at 10 Mile River, for example, Pudding Creek that runs right through Fort Bragg. And then the Navarro is another one where the bar really forms pretty solid when there's low flow. So next, I just want to give hopefully just a general picture of their life history. I don't know how much everybody knows about that, but I don't want to get it. Hopefully, it's basic enough, but not too detailed. It's just please ask questions too if you have any more. But we know that they're very highly migratory. They travel thousands of miles between freshwater and the ocean. They spend about half their time in the ocean. It's variable. Sometimes it depends on the species and it depends on conditions. So they might spend a little bit more or less time in freshwater in the ocean. Adults return to the rivers during those high winter flows to lay their eggs in the substrate. And they really depend on those flows to access all the upper extents of the spawning habitat. So because I just mentioned how tied this freshwater life stage is for salmon to their reproduction, I just wanted to bring up a picture of a flow graph. That what this is, this is called functional flow components. It's a model that was put out by this person in the paper, but it's a way to they're doing some modeling to try to figure out what are the best flows for all of our rivers. So when you can manage that, you have something to work with. But I liked how this showed our general trends of water over time. You have a small pulse flow, hopefully in the fall. We had a really big one this year, which is a triggering for nutrients to move around and to fish to start moving. And then when you start to get into winter, we've got that wet season base flow. That's when the major migration is happening. That's when the adults are getting up into the furthest reaches to spawn. And then you want to have a base flow that maintains water. So when they do deposit their eggs, those redds that they're building, their nests, don't get dewatered. And then the spring recession flow occurs, and that's when there's outmigration to the ocean. And you want to make well, I'm saying it like we want to make sure of something, but it's just this is what it should look like. So we have good habitat for salmon. But anyway, that spring recession flow is important to get the smolts out back into the ocean as well as steelhead. And then we have a dry season base flow, and we have fish that are in the river all year round. The little guys are living there all year round. And so having good flows in the summer are really important for their survival and having connectivity to different kinds of habitat. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a flows. I feel like that's the ultimate habitat that fish need is water, and the timing of that and the amount of that is really important. So the key freshwater habitat needs, the unimpaired flows from headwaters to the ocean, good water quality that provides those fish access to the spawning grounds and supports juvenile rearing year round. And then having clean spawning gravel and access to different kinds of rearing habitat so they can express different life histories, strategies, and also be able to have more habitat. So that should equate to having more space and more fish. So this is the picture. This is the adult migration period I've been talking about, and I just wanted to kind of highlight on the right this picture. This is our fish came in pretty early this year with that big October rain that most of us probably remember. And the picture on the right there is the salmon came in early under high flows, and then they kind of were just holding in these pools waiting to spawn. It was a little bit early for their typical spawning time. So yeah, so that was great because it pulled fish in. Some of the vulnerabilities that fish can have is if they don't have good flows to get up into the habitat they need, and they're limited to spawning grounds, then they're not able to access maybe the coldest water or the most space. Also for steelhead in particular, they need to go back out to the ocean, and so they need good flows to get back out. And of course, when you have real flow, then the low flows, the water's clearer, there's less habitat, and there's sometimes more increased predation risks. So the peak timing for when our fish come back, I'm kind of lumping everything together, but it's October through May. Typically Chinook and Coho, if there's high flows, it's about 7 inches to get our watersheds going. So the fish are able to get in, sometimes to break the bars, but it's about 7 inches of rain we need to start to get the rivers up. And that's when Coho and Chinook will come in. And steelhead are a little bit later, although they'll be in December, but they're more coming in the January timeframe and spawning a little bit later. They're semiparous. That means their reproductive strategy is that they die after they spawn, whereas steelhead are idioparous and they survive and they'll go back and forth to the ocean multiple times. And like I said, that magnitude and timing of flow really can impact the timing and distribution of spawning. This is a cross section of a redd or a nest. If you get out into our rivers sometime in December, you'll have there's some nice spots like on the Noyo that you can go down to. You can see this happening in action. And I'm going to show you a little video in a minute too, if you haven't seen it. But they take the males and females, they find each other. The females start building redds by digging their tail in the gravel substrate. You can see her digging her tail right there. And then the males come up and they deposit sperm and the eggs, and then they bury the eggs. They're a couple feet down into the The egg locations are about in here. And so that's where they'll spend a couple months incubating, and then they hatch into the Elvins, and they actually remain in the gravel for a whole nother month, and they feed off their yolk sac, and then they'll come up and emerge as fry after that. So some of the vulnerable, I'm going to show you a little quick video. This is one of my favorites. It's been around for a little while, but it's just a real nice clear picture of some Coho spawning. Hopefully that's coming through for everybody. I should have clicked that, sorry, but they're up there. So it looks like a couple male coho, and they are trying to fight for the female. You can see them biting the tails, and it's a beautiful color. You'll notice there's a little tag on one of the fish, and that's something that we do. We have a couple places where we handle adult fish and mark them, and then we use that to calibrate our spawning survey red estimates. So they have a little tiny tag, and we look for those when we're out working. So there you go. Like I said, after they die, the carcasses really provide a lot of nutrients to the forest. When we had really high populations of salmon in the past, this was it's hard to imagine how much has actually changed because we don't get the salmon back that we did. So they are a really important component of the whole ecosystem. I like this picture on the left is a bunch of caddisflies just eating the carcass away. It's a pretty common thing to see. Breaking it down. And so, yeah, when those eggs are they can be very vulnerable to really high flows. And so I'll talk a bit again, or a little bit about how some of our watersheds are degraded and why this might happen. But when you have really high flows and you don't have a fully functioning watershed, sometimes the flows are just too high and they'll scour those reds right out, and the eggs can kind of come out and not survive. Or when you have problems with too much silt from, say, road collapse or something, that can be almost too much silt and they can suffocate the eggs. Another problem can be if you don't have enough habitat and you have a lot of spawners, you could have a lot of superimposition, but we don't run into that too much around here. And then this other phase, so we've got the spawning, and then the fry get up into the watersheds, and they emerge in March to June. In the spring, they distribute out, they seek shelter along the bank margins, and they start feeding on all these zooplankton and insects. They move around some, seeking out food, trying to move away from some of their the other fish so they can reduce competition. So it's important to have a lot of habitat. And then when we have Chinook in our systems, they actually leave their first year. They'll go down to the estuary, spend a little bit of time, and they'll be out into the ocean in about June, somewhere May, April, June. They leave the first year. Our steelhead and our coho hold a whole summer, at least. Could be one, typically for coho, but 2 years and even 3 years. So these fish, depending on conditions and depending on different circumstances, will hold in freshwater for a long time. So after that summer rearing period ends, and I'll talk about that in a second, then we get into our first fall rains, and that's cooling down the temperatures, and the movement starts. Hopefully you get some connectivity with habitat if it's been disconnected, and they can move around, and then that's a period when they start really growing and getting ready to migrate out in the springtime. And so some of the things that are lacking in this period, well, some of the needs are, they need lots of protection from high flows. They need access to floodplains where there's a lot of food resources, and healthy riparian forests that provide dynamic channel forms and provide terrestrial insects and food for them to eat. And same thing with estuaries. They have a lot of productivity and feeding, because it's very important for these guys to grow a lot, and when they enter the ocean, they have better chances for survival. I'm not going to show you all this video because it's a little bit long, but I like to plug this in here. This is summer rearing conditions out on the Garcia. I was snorkeling around out there. We were trying to get an idea of what the distribution of juveniles looked like this year. This was last year. Had a pretty successful run. So like I said, they have this extended period of freshwater. They're very susceptible to warming water, disconnected habitat. It's typically a period of limited movement. They're kind of just they're feeding, but they're not moving around a lot of because there's not a lot of flow and sometimes disconnected. These are coho. And if you have a snorkel and mask and pop your head in the creek, you probably get a good chance to see some, if not steelhead, and there's some other really neat fish species out there too. They're really distinct with that white marking on their anal fin and on their dorsal fin. It's kind of long, frilly fins compared to if you were looking at a steelhead at that size or a coho. There's some other distinguishing characters. They like to be hanging out they like cover and large wood and pools. They like slower velocity habitat with in comparison to steelhead, who prefer riffle habitat, a little bit faster, enables them to survive together. One of the troubles when we have really constricted flows is that steelhead and coho get more shoved into the same habitat, more into pools, where actually coho maybe have an advantage. They're bigger probably at that stage. And then, yeah, so steelhead will get mixed in with them. So anyway, that's can be a vulnerability that I'll talk about in 1 second. But water temperature is really a key environmental variable. Fortunately, on the coast, our water temperatures are pretty good. When you start to move inland and you get up into the upper watersheds, it does start to get warmer. It's not ideal habitat, but closer to the coast, water temperatures, when there's water, stays pretty good. Like I said, some of the vulnerability, especially when we have really low drought years, like we've seen these last 2 years, some of the worst conditions is that habitat gets disconnected. So you've got isolated pools, and it's not always a bad thing, but because sometimes if the oxygen level is good and the temperatures are good, they can survive till the rains come. But some of these habitats completely dry out too. And so then finally, after these fish hold for a whole year, or the Chinook at their first year, they'll get out into the ocean and leave as smolts. They're going through some changes, some hormone concentrations and environmental cues that get them wanting to go out to the ocean. And like Tim mentioned, they're getting out there, in the period of upwelling is really important. Because it's that period when there's a lot of food, and so that's when they're going out, and then this time of the year through May, they're hopefully timing it well. They live in this zone, the epipelagic zone, and they spend 1 to 2 more summers out there, and that's where they're putting about 90% of their growth when they go out in the ocean. And the growth and survival is better when there's upwelling. And yeah, I'm going to move on because I don't want to get gotten a little delayed where I want to be right now. So this is just a summary of what I just talked about. Kind of on the bottom is their timing and their of each life stage I discussed. And on the top are flows. Their monthly flows over time. This is actually, I think it's on the Noyo. I'm sorry, I thought it was a Navarro, the Noyo, but it's showing different water years from October to September and how much variability we can have. But here, the average from 1950 to 2020, you can see some of the higher winter flows, an average, were much higher than what we've been seeing in recent years. This 2022 is a red line, and the 2021 is the dashed line. So we did have this nice peak flow early in the season, which was great to recharge the rivers after seeing really low summer flows and then bringing our fish in, and we had some good rain, but now we're back down to below what we had last year, fortunately. And then just another glimpse of over time what it looks like to have a really wet year, like in January in 2017. We had a pretty good year in 2019. And then these are hourly flows in the Navarro River over several years. But these little blips are the water, the more recent high peak flows, which not very much recently. So historic land practices have really altered these watersheds and severely decreased the abundance of salmon and excluded populations from their historic range. The logging from the mid-1800s and the post-World War II rapid timber extraction really did some damage to our watersheds, and we're still seeing a lot of that legacy impacts now. Some of the impacts are losses of trees, erosion, siltation, channel simplification, and incision. Still currently today, many of our channels are in size, and what that means, they're cut down so low, they're out of their floodplain access when high flows come up, so like 10 to 15 feet. And that causes not only they can't access the floodplains, but then there's some surface groundwater disconnection. So really our fish crisis began in the 50s. People started to recognize, wow, that the numbers are low. And a lot of the streams were actually just clogged with logging debris. And so through the 60s and the 90s, there was actually a lot of small scale hatchery efforts to repair, to try to boost the populations. There wasn't a lot of success for that. Hatchery, intervening with hatchery is definitely a delicate balance. It's a very common thing to have happen, very widespread, but it's not always successful in certain circumstances. But really, a lot of the Forest Protection Act and environmental laws in the 70s really helped to improve conditions. There was some restoration that happened in the rivers, stream cleaning, they called it, to get a lot of that debris out. It probably really was a trouble for passage. But then we kind of shifted our restoration strategy, focusing more into actually getting that wood back into the rivers and getting a little bit different shift. So all of these 3 species are listed in the late 90s, but the Coho were listed as endangered in 2005. This is all up and down the West Coast. When I say 28 salmons were federally listed then. And so to recover the species, we have recovery planning, and with these listings come plans with strategies to avoid extinction. There are specific actions to reduce threats. And one of the most important, one very important component that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the monitoring, and why that's important. So some of the current threats, and I've touched on these, climate change. It's really intensifying the shift in the water regime. We may be getting as much water some years, but it's all truncated into one place. And as you saw in that hydrograph, we need to have varying flows over a whole season, at least for salmon. This is for all of the ecosystem, but for salmon. There's going to be a marine ecosystem shift that has all sorts of consequences. It could be shifts in the food chain out there, but it also could, it affects our climate and our fog and temperatures. I mentioned the incision. We have illegal diversions. There's groundwater pumping. I think those are some issues in some of our watersheds, not all. And then our genetic and life history diversity has really just been truncated because of all the problems with the habitat to begin with, and now kind of adding climate change on top of that, it's very challenging. And so some of those strategies are to rehabilitate the watershed, conserving water. I'm going to touch on this just very lightly, but sometimes conservation rearing hatchery practices can be appropriate in some watersheds. Something they are doing in the Russian River. There's a hatchery to try to help the Coho. Regulations, permitting, enforcement, those are all things that can help with improving conditions in watersheds. But the partnerships with all of the agencies and everybody, the people in this meeting tonight, and it's really a community effort, even coming down to doing our monitoring and getting permission to access the watershed and having the support of everybody, and trying to work towards common goals. Sorry, I skipped ahead somehow too far. So I don't, this conservation ring, this really struck me when I was looking at the website, your Audubon website, and I have been to Kauai myself, but I was reading about the Hawaiian petrel, and I was realizing there's a lot of parallels between these birds and our salmon, mainly because they travel so far. They spend years out at sea. That was amazing to me. And then they come back to the islands and they find a little burrow up in the mountains, and then they have a nest, and then they're really subject to predation by like cats and things that are feral. And so they're doing a similar thing with these birds as we did with our fish, where they go and get the chicks and they put them into a protected area to grow them up into adults. Well, we've tried something very similar on a couple of our watersheds as a pilot program, taken some of our juveniles, reared them to adults in the hatchery, and there's a picture of one, and released it back into the river. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not so focused that I don't think other, I know so many species are very highly migratory, but I thought that was just really interesting to me, looking at some of the life history of that bird and thinking about what they add. So how do we do this measuring? I said it was important to understand the populations and the trends. And so we, along with NOAA Fisheries and many others, have developed a monitoring program to collect essential data on the status of the fish. Because it's really hard to manage a species if you don't know how many there are. And it takes a long time to, it takes many generations and years to understand trends, and if you're having a positive or a negative direction. It's hard with their life history to go out just 1 year or one time and determine, what the status is. And it's important to get over long-term, their whole range as well. So here's just a couple maps of where monitoring is occurring under this coastal monitoring plan. The left map is showing places where we have a monitoring either occurring or will be occurring, hopefully in the future, extending all the way up and down the state. It's Steelhead down there on the south. And on the right is, again, those blue on the Mendocino Coast. That's the place that I'm going to talk about and share some data with you. So there's several attributes of populations that we can measure to know what the long-term persistence of a species and what is needed for recovery. These are called viable salmonid population parameters. And so it's abundance, productivity, spatial structure, and diversity. And so when you have a viable population, they're buffered, they're resilient to environmental effects. And so this plan was designed to provide a robust landscape level sampling design, and including life cycle monitoring stations that provide information on these parameters. So we can actually, so we can assess them and define, so we can assess what they are and understand how our populations are doing. So the criteria include abundance targets, numbers, how the population should be distributed across the landscape, and what that should look like for reproductive connectivity and genetic exchange. The design of our sample is it's standardized, so which is very important when you're collecting scientific information. Like I said, it's for long-term data to inform the recovery. There's so much ground to cover, you couldn't just go do everything, you have to sample. And so this is a way to estimate large areas, and then we have measures to reduce errors. And like I said, it's along with all the restoration work, it's really important to have partnerships and community support to make this kind of big picture design work. And here are some of the partners that are involved. So it's a two-stage design. We do spawning surveys, and spawning surveys are hiking out there in the winter, doing red counts during the time when the fish come back. It's a spatially balanced design. So we do, it's a random sample over spatially balanced over time. And so we have places we go every year. We have places that we go every 3 years. We have places that we go every 12 years, and it's over a 30-year panel. And so we're somewhere different every year, except for some places we're the same place every year doing these surveys. This balances the need for both getting estimates and then looking at trends over the whole frame. You can sample more if you want more precision. And then we take those red counts and expand them into adult estimates. The second part is is the life cycle monitoring. It's where we get, it's on smaller rivers or tributaries of some of our rivers where we collect more intensive information, and we're looking at fish in and fish out. So we're measuring how many adults come back, how many juveniles go out, and these, because we're collecting more information on more red surveys, we can calibrate these regional red estimates, and then we can also evaluate trends in marine and freshwater survival. And these are essential to understanding factors that might be limiting freshwater production, interpreting broader trends in spawner abundance, if we're seeing increases or decreases, and then we know if the fish are responding, like if they're growing more or moving or surviving, and then we can, it helps us understand why. Another but one of the things what we can do with these LCMs is we can answer, not only can we understand our information better about trends, but we can answer questions about effectiveness of monitoring or doing habitat restoration. So do the management actions that increase habitat quality and quantity, like putting wood in, do they lead to increased abundance and recovery? So it really provides this nice platform to do these experiments or studies. We've got two going on in the Mendocino Coast. Well, one's complete. It was done in Pudding Creek, where it was extensively treated with wood. And then there's one in 10 Mile, which is a little bit different, but it's more of a floodplain habitat restoration, and that's ongoing. And they both have a study design called a BACI, where you're looking at before and after a treatment, and then you have a control to compare it to see if the changes you're seeing associated with the habitat treatment or fish response are different than that control. I'm not going to get into the details of that too much, but we definitely learned some really interesting things on the Pudding Creek experiment. We didn't really see, we did not see a watershed level response. And there was probably a few reasons for that, but what that helps us to do is understand if that's the kind of habitat work we need to be doing. Do we need to do more or less, or understand? There's sometimes more questions come up, but it was really informative. So here's our study area for where we do all of our spawning surveys. It's 339 reaches, 500 miles. We try to do about 15%, so that's about 40 reaches. And there's all the rivers. Our main rivers, what we call independent population watersheds, are the bigger ones: 10 Mile, Nuevo, Big, Elbe, and Navarro, in the Garcia. And then we have 5 life cycle stations interspersed in there. This is just a picture of what it looks like when you do a draw in a year. The red squiggly lines are places we selected to do a survey. So here's the Navarro. We would go out and do spawner surveys on all those spaces. And then the yellow highlight is actually, that is one of our life cycle monitoring stations, where we have a trap. This is, and this is run by Mendocino Redwood Company biologists and in partnership with us, but they have a trap to collect juveniles moving out. And they do a full spawning census on this whole watershed to help calibrate the rest of the space. It's very important to get landowner access and permission and do scouting. There's a lot involved with that. And then we wait for rain to get the spawning ground surveys going. Hiking from November to May. It's challenging, tough work. It can be very weather dependent. If there's high flows, you can't go out. But that's sometimes when the fish like to be out there. So it's a balance of trying to get out there every 2 weeks. It's challenging to climb some of the wood jams. They're great habitat, but you can tell when we're really loading wood up how much more challenging it becomes to actually get through these reaches. And so we're looking for reds, we're looking for carcasses. Often you smell them before you see them sometimes. And then we're looking for live fish. And so these are all 3 really important components to understanding what species made the red. We have to identify these fish. Is it a coho or is it a Chinook, based on just a few characteristics sometimes. And when we're out there, we do something called an eco-community study. And so just kind of not on the side, but it is, we're focusing on fish, but we do record amphibians and reptiles and predators. And so we do identify quite a few birds out there. We see mergansers and dippers, and we see spotted owls, saw bald eagle out on the Noyo the other day. So we record all that information as we're out there too. And then part of those life cycle stations, there's adult traps. So we do handle some fish, and that helps to calibrate our numbers of how many fish make how many reds. So we mark them, we look for them, and then we know how many live fish there were, how many reds there were, and then we get a ratio and we can apply that far and wide. We also look at these adults to see if they have tags, and they may have been tagged when they were going out to the ocean, and these captured in the traps as juveniles. And so we operate these during peak out migration period time, February to May. These are the smolts going out to the ocean. We have to manage this every day, but we get smolt abundance estimates from this. And we also have, this helps us to measure marine and freshwater survival. So every fish is, well, here, I won't say that yet, but the graphic here, what's up at the top is several years of smolts moving out at the North Fork Navarro trap. And so all this is showing you is kind of the timing and the numbers that are going out. This is very flow dependent sometimes. In this year, in I think it was 2017, I think that was a high water year, so we probably had more water longer. You can see the fish were still migrating out in high numbers late in the season. So all of these fish that are of size get also marked with passive integrated transponders, or PIT tags, we call them. They're tracking tags. They don't require power. They have a microchip that's activated when it passes close to a special antenna, kind of like the microchips you do on your pets. And then it's connected to a computer that records the identity of the tag and then the time it passed by an antenna, or if we have a wand, if we're at those adult traps or at these juvenile traps. So that helps us understand when fish are moving out as well. But it's really also to make sure we know how many fish to calibrate our efficiency of our traps. So we're not sampling 100% of the river, so we need to see how efficient we are at capturing them. So we'll mark them with the tags, put them back upstream, and then capture them again, and then we'll get an efficiency for how effective our traps are and to get our smolt. Okay, finally, all that to the results. So I've got 3 graphics here, and I don't think I put the species on them, which isn't very helpful, is it? Fortunately, I think I know what they are, but they're showing some of our major rivers where we get estimates over a long time frame. We have about 12 or 13 years at many of our places. We have more at some others. The top left is the Coho, and then to the right here is the Steelhead. Yep. And then Chinook is, like I mentioned earlier, much lower numbers. We had one kind of big year there, but you can see the numbers are ranging annually. Oh, a big year was about 8,000. But now, because of the way we have this, we know how many fish are coming back to each of these watersheds every year. Really, you need a minimum of 4 generations to start to understand trends and abundance. And it can be a little misleading if you just look at a single year, because there's natural variation. They express different life histories where they may stay for a whole nother year. So you don't necessarily lose a whole year class, but so looking at 1 year is not particularly informative sometimes of the status or trend. So when you have longer term data sets like we do on the Noyo and Pudding Creek, you can look at this a little bit more long term. What I put here are the delisting criteria. And then I put a 3-year rolling average, which just kind of shows you like their 3-year life history cycle, what a 3-year would look like. So my my point here is that we're still really well below delisting. We did make 1 year above it on the Noyo. Our coastal rivers have probably some of the best populations of the CCC Coho compared to the other locations, but we're still well below recovery. And here's another example. So this is some of our two of our 10-year or 12-year data sets. We had a gap year. We didn't get it. We didn't have funding and we didn't survey, and so that makes it challenging to look at a trend as well. But again, the levels that they've set to recover the species, which are way up there, we're quite a bit below. Better 10 Mile is much closer than, say, the Garcia. And this is just kind of to show for each of our creeks the percentage. What I'm showing is the percent, how close we are to recovery. So the average is the dark blue for 12 years of data, and the gray is the recovery target. So we're, in the Noyo River, for example, we're about 36% on average for that average of recovering. So quite low. This is for Coho. For Steelhead, quite low too. I know sometimes we think Steelhead are a lot more resilient and tougher, but they're actually very low numbers as well. So this year, you saw, kind of give you an idea of what has been happening over time. I don't have numbers to exactly share with you because we're still processing that, but the early rains really brought some fish in quite early. They held for a while and didn't really get spawning until about December, but it was nice because it brought them high up into the watersheds. So that's something that can be really good. Sometimes there's more water in certain places and getting them spread out. And so overall, we had average to below Coho returns this year compared to all those other years. Somewhere like the Elbia and actually did a little bit better than average. We had higher numbers of Chinook. That was up and down the whole coast, actually, a lot of coastal watersheds. I'd be really curious to see the outcome of that. But yeah, we had a lot more Chinook. And unfortunately, with these flows, we had really nice high peak flows, but then we've had really no rain since December. And so a lot of the reds get exposed to air and dewatered. So that can cause in some locations, that can cause mortality. Right now, steelhead spawning is peak. It's stronger seeming in our more southern rivers, but their distribution is limited because they, like I was mentioning, they come in a little bit later than the Coho and the Chinook, and they spawn later. Now is peak, while for Coho, December, January are peak spawning. So they're held in the lower watersheds and not able to get up this high, but they are spawning. So I do, as last year, have some concerns for our smolts getting out. If the Navarro bar, which I think is closed now, keeps closed, it's hard for them to get out. And then over summer conditions are not great. And steelhead actually will get trapped as well. So so I've focused a lot here. That's our monitoring information, and we're clearly in a drought, and that affects all of us, but it also affects our ecosystem and our salmon. And so one of the things that we're doing a little bit extra this year is we have some drought stressor monitoring. We have a new position at CDFW with some scientific aids, and we're going to attempt to get out into the watersheds this year and do a little bit more a look at where places are drying and where they're staying wet. So we have a better understanding of refugia, where they're drying. So maybe we could do some types of management actions. Sometimes that might involve figuring out how to get more water in the creek. It might also be a fish rescue. So we're trying to get a better grasp on that, and we can really incorporate our fish data with that too. I just watched a really great talk, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife also is having, they have another drought stressor position. This is up in the Klamath, but he did a really good talk on all the resources that are available to help us with grants, and there's a lot of funds that seem like it will help with, especially people struggling with just having water. I put a real quick list of them here, but I have access to a spreadsheet that has a lot more information. So if anyone is interested in that and wants to reach out to Tim or somebody, I'm happy to share that. I haven't gotten into all of it. It's a little bit outside of what I normally do, but I know there's a lot of resources, and I I just mentioned, yeah, fish rescue can be sometimes a technique, but I also, and I see Linda on here, but the research, the RCD is a great resource as well, and she probably knows a lot of these things, but I do feel like there's a lot of really great resources to help us, improve habitat, especially if you're a landowner on a watershed, or there's different things. Plus, there's a lot of partners and groups just doing a lot of different kind of habitat work too. So I think it's overwhelming to me trying to think sometimes, what can we do best to help the salmon, and I always think, finding our ways to reduce our carbon footprint and support policies and technologies. That's something that's probably one of the bigger picture things we can try to work towards. But I think, knowing your local ecosystem and how what you might be doing is impacting it, or you're just understanding it better, I think that's just huge. I know that these are all really important to, these watersheds are important to us for many different kinds of reasons, whether that be recreation or our water sources or just the beauty of it. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I've said this several times, but I think we're just working together to, really be careful and considerate about how we move forward. I think this is, we need to work together. And with that, I think I've said all these things a whole bunch, but I wanted to show you one last cool video, because there's another fish species that likes to get out there. Oh, why is it not going to... I hope it lets me play. Well, it's not looking like a video, but that's a lamprey, and they are spawning out there in the river, right along with the steelhead. They build redds. They look a little more like a campfire ring in the middle of the river, but they lay eggs. They live in the ocean. They're anadromous. They do pretty much the same thing as our salmon. They die after they spawn. Have a really interesting life history, and they're an important component of the food web as well, and ecosystem. So that's all I have. I took probably hopefully not too much of everybody's time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. We do have some questions to raise. And normally I work from the first one down, but I think I will work from the bottom up, and we'll just kind of go back through the presentation.
Oh, I stopped sharing, but I could. Okay, I can always bring the thing back up if you guys want to.
Yeah, because some of these are specific to certain slides, I think.
Oh, okay. I'll do that then. I'll reshare.
Somebody just now asked, you mentioned the word refugia, and I think maybe there might be looking for a definition for what that word actually means.
Yeah. So when I say refugia, I'm thinking about that for salmon would be places that retain water all summer, and they have good levels of oxygen and water temperatures. So sometimes these places are fed, it could be very variable in a watershed, and we don't have a great handle on that. We know particular places dry up really fast. Like there's some tributaries on the Navarro that we know they're going to dry, but there's also places on some of the tributaries that retain water longer. So when you identify where those are, they hold water longer. That could be somewhere where maybe you even focus more habitat restoration to improve it more, or it's a place where if you did a fish rescue and there were no fish, maybe you could move fish to that location. There's more to go into it, but that's what it means. It's defined. Refugia is places that would retain water in the summer months, where salmon and steelhead survive, juveniles.
So like a deep, cold pool.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. a deep, cold pool can have, well, not usually, but it can have really low oxygen, and sometimes those places are not that great for fish. It depends. It could be a deep,
they get stratified.
Yeah. Or think about the estuary and the Navarro when it's closed off.
Yeah, I remember many years ago standing on the bridge over the Navarro at Philo, right there by the apple farm and looking down into that pool and seeing a bunch of steelhead, and that was in the midsummer, and there was very little flow. This was even before the drought started, and it was, you know, time of year when there was very little flow, and we just looked at them and thought they were doomed, but they may have actually found one of those places they could make it through that long, hot, dry spell.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had a lot of people calling about observations of that on the Navarro and in the Garcia, a few places, and you know, we were like, is there anything we can do? You know, really challenging. But when we started our spawning surveys this fall, there were steelhead out there, and I'm pretty sure those were not returning from the ocean. They looked like they had been in the system all summer. So I think that they found their refugia. They found their places.
Well, that's encouraging if they can find places to survive even in this really severe drought. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So while you've got the slide up, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that's been promising. You know, we started our smolt traps and we wondered, you know, what we were going to see from the smolts moving out right now because they had over summered and really bad conditions. And we're capturing fish, and so we do have some evidence that they did survive. You know, some of the juveniles survived too. Yeah,
that's good. That's good. I was going to ask, because while you have the slide up about the lamprey, we hear about them mainly in the Eel River, right? For, you know, where the river got its name, but are they in all these coastal streams?
Yeah, they're not in everyone. They seem to be in the larger ones, and so there's really good populations in the 10-mile. We don't have them in like Casper or Pudding Creek, so some of those smaller rivers have not seen them. I'm not sure if they were traditionally there or not. Yeah, but the bigger rivers, they're there.
So maybe the Albion?
Yep.
How about the Navarro, since it gets closed off so much? Is that keep them out, or are they in it too?
No, they're coming in. You know, they are actually really interesting. Sometimes I think they come in, they come in at different times. They're a little bit of a mystery, but they'll come in like the fall and then hold over for a whole nother year and spawn. Their juveniles live down in the substrate for up to 7 years too.
Evening.
They're really interesting. Yeah.
So someone asked, relative to the following on with that, with the closed bar streams, when the bars are, and this question comes up every year, when the bar doesn't open and the fish can't get out, is there a management action for that? So this opens up, I think, a pretty large can of worms. But if you could shed some light on, you know, what could be done and why sometimes it's best not to.
Yeah, good point. Because I know there are places, the Russian River, I believe Pescadero Creek, they do breach their bars. To my knowledge, so we know the Navarro has always had a long period of closing. I think I've looked at some historical pictures where there was a jetty back in the 1800s even to keep it open. And I've kind of looked at some of those historical documents, and it talks about it opening, closing. So it's kind of interesting to know, like, I know that it can be very flow driven, but it also has to do with what's going out there in the ocean too. But I don't have a great answer for you. I think it's probably something that could and should be explored in this suite of things we're thinking about when we're trying to restore the fishery. I think it's pretty complicated with probably permitting and, you know, the success of doing that. And there can be, you know, if you breach a bar and it evacuates too quickly, you can have issues too. So I think it's pretty, you know, it'd have to be thought out really well, but it hasn't been that big of a problem in the past years, but we're really seeing that in these last, you know, 10 or so years at least, I think. So I don't have.
Yeah, I know one thing that Renee Pasquinelli had pointed out when this came up years ago is that there's a risk of a catastrophic fish kill because if you breach the bar when there isn't actually enough freshwater flow, and the bar is there because there isn't enough freshwater flow. So what you wind up doing is suddenly draining out a whole bunch of fresh water that's floating. We don't think of it this way when we look at the river, but in those estuaries, it's actually mostly salt water. And there's a little layer of fresh water kind of floating on top of the salt water that's underneath that. And if you drain off the fresh water, all those freshwater fish are suddenly immersed in salt water.
Right.
And if it happens gradually, you know, in the natural way, they adapt to it. If it happens in a matter of minutes, they go belly up. So
Right.
it's not so simple as to just open it up and let them out to sea.
Right. I know that like in Pescadero Creek, that has something like that's happened. And they've had to be really careful about timing and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So if you can do it when there's freshwater flow, then you got a better chance, I think.
Yeah. And most of the time you'd have enough freshwater flow where it's not an issue, but
Right, exactly.
yeah.
Linda, go ahead.
Hi, wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much. I learned so much on these talks. I really appreciate Mendocino Coast Audubon bringing you back for us and giving us an update. Around the bar, I just wanted to say I hadn't quite heard that piece that you were just saying about that Renee Pasquinelli had talked about, but it's kind of the inverse of what I have heard, is that inviting the fish in, if the bar is there and the flows aren't there, basically it's a sign that the habitat upstream isn't necessarily there either.
That's a good point.
So inviting the fish into a system that's not going to support them at this time, you know, they'll just hang out. But anyway, it's complex, and I agree, it just definitely needs worthy of more study. Something that we hope to be making strong suggestions for.
Yeah,
Right.
Sarah mentioned, you know, I saw some documents that I think at least Faroese showed me that the Corps of Engineers was looking at this, you know, way back mid-century, 70 years ago. They were talking about, you know, do we need to go in there and breach this bar? And they couldn't come to a conclusion then, and they revisited it over and over and over again until sometime in the 1980s, I think. They just kind of threw their hands up and said, you know what, this is never going to happen. It just, the technical challenges on top of the environmental challenges were just way too complex. Yeah.
The other, when you were talking about Refugia, I wanted to just say that there's also winter Refugia that we work on habitat wise as well in the Navarro, where, you know, the opposite, you know, again, you know, we're looking at probably more severe droughts and longer droughts with climate change, but also flashier and maybe higher flood events. And so one of the things is that with winter Refugia is to have the habitat where the fish can get out of the high flows that are like being, and if you imagine like being on a highway and just getting run over by the high flows, it's places where they can get out of those high flows and rest and not just get bowled out of the system or over.
Good analogy. Yeah, that's right. And that is one of the things that we learned from some of the data that we collected in our life cycle stations when we looked at juveniles and adults and flows, and this is pretty common knowledge too, but our data showed that we think that winter was a limiting factor, and it has to do with not having access to the refugia and the high flow times. And like I had mentioned, so many of our channels are so in size, they don't have access to those floodplains even in the highest flows, or the structure's been removed, so they don't have any place to hide. So yeah, good point. Two different kinds of refugia, winter and summer.
So someone asked if you measure the water flows, or do you get those from the water agencies? Oh,
I should have, if I didn't recognize it, I pulled those from the USGS, the two gauges on the Noyo and the Navarro. There's some other gauges out in that the Nature Conservancy has out. Linda, you probably know better too, but I know there's some more specific gauges around. But no, we don't. Nope, we're not measuring any flows. We might do some like riffle crest depth measurements when we're out doing some of that habitat work this summer. But yeah, no. I guess my ultimate answer is no.
The interesting thing about those gauges, if you don't mind me saying, is that you can sign up with the USGS gauges and get those email reports, put a threshold and get those in your email box on whatever timeline you'd like. But it's really interesting to watch the flows.
Yeah, And if it's a really good year, you get buzzed all the time. But
Right.
now it's like, hey, can you please tell me something's happening?
Yeah, that Navarro gauge is a great resource, actually. I use that. I've used that at times when I was on the radio on Sunday mornings, and to tell when Highway 128 was going to close, because it has the flood stage marked on it, and you can actually see right on the live on the web when the river is going to hit the highway and close it off. So it's got a lot of utility. It is a great resource. And
yeah, and you can really see when it fills up and then it drops. That's when you know the bar breaks too, when it does that really
right,
rapid.
exactly. Yeah, it backs up and then whoosh. The other interesting thing about that is that same website for that same gauge has historical data. So you can go back and see what the great floods have looked like. And, you know, flood stage is something like 23 feet, and that river has hit like 39 feet, I think, is the highest one. It's hit that twice, even just in the last 30 years. So when you drive the highway and see the watermarks on those trees, you think, what the heck is that? That can't be where the water was. And yeah, it really was.
Yeah. Navarro is a big, I think, is that our biggest watershed, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, on the coast. Yeah, like that's within the county.
Yep.
The Navarro gauge is also super interesting, I think, is that it's, well, all the gauges for the Noyo and Navarro, they were really looking at flood stage, right? And built for flood stage. And now
Right.
we're watching them more closely in a way for during droughts, and we're using them for thresholds for pumping and all kinds of things. And so they have to be calibrated, and what you can see sometimes it gets a little off on it if it hasn't been calibrated. So, you know, even though we're watching it really closely for drought conditions. I mean, the Navarro got down to 0. This is an example, down to 0 CFS last year for the first time. It's often at 0.5 CFS for weeks at a time. And in a flood stage event, I think it was the 55 flood was like at like 61,000 CFS. That's gives you a little
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nonlinear systems. Yeah.
And the fish and the salmon and everything else are adapted to that to some degree, but not with the degraded habitat. It's more challenging. But sometimes I'm amazed that we have salmon left. Just, you know, everything they've gone through to get to this point. So
Yeah, exactly.
I want to make sure they keep staying here.
Here's maybe a quick question. Is somebody wants to know, is Jack Peters Creek a spawning stream? Right there north of Mendocino.
It's not in our sample frame, but I want to say that it probably is for steelhead. It might be. I feel like there's a barrier or something there though. Sorry, I don't know the details of that one.
But you don't monitor it.
We don't monitor Jack Peters. It's not part of our sample frame. At some point, I didn't say how we selected that sample frame, but it has to do with mostly where salmon and steelhead would or could be spawning. So it's all their habitat that exists. And so sometimes places, if they had like a significant barrier on it, we would have left it off. But I'm sorry, I don't know Jack Peters. I know the little beach down there, but I don't know.
I don't think it has much of a watershed, so it might not really.
Yeah.
All
They
right.
do pop up in some of those small ones, though. We'd be surprised.
So do you also test do you take water samples and test for pollutants and the effects of land use on the runoff water?
Not my part of, not what I do. I do just the salmon and steelhead monitoring, not any, I would say the Water Quality Control Board probably does more of that. Then that's not something that my program does. But
Yeah,
I think
the Regional Water Quality Control Board does that for certain, the larger streams. I think they do that on the Garcia and the Wallala River. And I'm not sure if they're doing that on any of these 10 Mile. I think they do some, and most of these rivers, the rivers where they're sampling and doing that monitoring, they have some regulatory criteria to try to meet the maximum daily load numbers for mainly for sediment. They're looking
Right.
at turbidity and suspended sediment.
And a lot of that's been improved, you know, for all the restoration work that's been done and over time, and a lot of that's been improved. I mean, I think after a lot of the roads got cleaned up, and so I don't think that that's so much a trouble anymore in a lot of our watersheds. It is probably some places, but.
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing, you know, we've had some speakers before that were talking about the watershed restoration work. And, you know, a big part of that is attempting to mitigate the sedimentation damage that happened from all the habitat alteration from all the logging over the decades, and more, even worse than that, the road building. So they're
Right.
still doing, I know State Parks is doing an immense amount of work on Big River.
Yeah.
Trying to fix all those roads that are dumping sediment into the river.
Yeah.
Let's see, somebody just asked if Little River is a spawning stream.
Yes.
That's amazing, because it really is little.
I wish I present. So that's one of our really long-term life cycle stations. We haven't done it in a couple of years, but had smolt traps. But we do a census because it's pretty small. But it has been monitored, and there's small populations of coho, but it's a coho stream, a steelhead stream. Yep. And they are working. There's a couple like kind of smallish low flow barriers right now that State Parks is working on, I believe. There's on here, but yeah, it is, and it's a great place to go see them spawning when they're in there, because you've got a trail that goes up the entire river, and so you can just kind of pause and look.
Yeah.
Great place.
Yeah, it's accessible and it's not so big. You can see right into it.
Yeah, yeah. I like that one at the end of the day because you can hike out on the trail. Sometimes you have to hike up the creek and then back down the creek, and it's nice to pop out on the trail.
Yeah. Let's see, going back a little bit, somebody had asked if there was a slide you had with three pictures of people sampling in the streams, and somebody asked what was going on with the funnel-shaped floats that were in the stream, and then somebody else said it's a fish trap, and I just wondered if this one, and then there was a previous one too that had
This one?
three different things going on. Somebody looked like a net out in a red, and then there was a floating doohickey, and yeah, wait.
Oh, this one?
No, there were three pictures across the bottom. Oh, that's not it either. It was your data collection. Yeah, your data collection slide, I think.
This one?
There, that's it. That's the one I was thinking of. Yeah. And somebody had a question about,
oh yeah, like what are these things?
Yeah, what's going on in these pictures?
So so this first one, I know you can see my notes now, probably, sorry.
Mm-mm.
No, you're
okay.
fine.
Oh, you can't? Oh, good. So this one this is a red in the river. And the person it's very important component of our hiking is that we have it's like a broom handle really with measurements on it, but it's our wading stick. It's critical because you need it to walk through the water without falling, I think. But also we measure these reds. So he's kind of pointing at it. He's probably taking some depth and he's taking some measurements. I think he was probably staging this picture, but yeah, this is us identifying a red. We get to the red. We mark it with flagging, we mark it with GPS. I didn't get into the data collection, but we have everything with these really nice forms on our iPhones to collect all the information. And so we mark this red and go back every 2 weeks and look at it and see how it's changed, if it's still identifiable. And that helps us to not double count reds. And it helps us to, identify when they're new or not. So we really try to keep track of that so we don't over or underestimate. And then this picture, this is a rotary screw trap. And so this is the trap that I was saying that we collect our smolts when they're moving downstream. So you set this, it's basically a stainless steel cone that spins and it's a one-way in. It's just like a corkscrew. So the fish are coming in from here, from the upstream end, and then they'll pop into this cone and it spins around. And then there's a trap back here where this person's working up the fish. They've got the lid open, but usually the lid's closed. And that's where we take all the fish out of the back of the trap. And then we'll bring them up to the shore and check them for tags, measure them, or apply tags. And then, so the two, it is kind of funny out there, or looking at it, but the things, it's being held up by floats, basically. It's a pontoon. So it floats, it goes up and down with the flows. It's got a cable that connects it to a tree so it doesn't go downstream. And it will go through pretty high flows, but when it gets really high, you have to pull it out. You can't really fish it when it's really, really high flows. So we are limited by that. We're limited by that with all the work we do. If it's raining or the rivers are too high, you don't get very good data. And then this last one, it's not a very great picture, but this is an adult fish trap. And so I think, let me see if I had a picture of, I think I had a better picture. Yeah, so basically that person was like standing in this trap, but there's a weir. And so what the weir does is block fish from going upstream, but it forces it into this trap right here. So the weir floats, it kind of goes up and down. The fish can't move up past it, but there's an opening and they'll go into this trap. And that's where we get in and we get in. They won't go back out because it's a really narrow opening. And that's where we trap our fish and then we'll release them upstream. So that's how we operate it, to do capture them and then do a market capture estimate on them to find out. You can estimate how many there were, but it also helps you understand how many adult fish there were and then how many reds were built. I didn't get into some of the life history, but sometimes you have more males than females. They're called jacks. They've only spent one summer out in the ocean and it's part of the life history strategy, but sometimes you'll have a lot of those returning. So you could potentially overestimate your population if you had like an equal number of males and females. So that's why it's important to understand that relationship. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I kind of glazed over that. Sorry about I forget how weird these things look. And
yeah, exactly. It's a different world.
Yeah.
So early on, you started off, I think, with a picture of a school of fish that had come in that October rain and were gathered in a pool. Somebody wanted to know what stream that was, and are those salmon or steelhead?
That stream, that first was that was in the Noyo River.
The Noyo, okay.
And they were coho.
Coho. So there's your endangered species. So I had a question. You were talking about their life cycle and that the coho will stay in the river for 2 and sometimes 3 years. And what's the adaptive benefit to that? It seems a risky strategy down in California when you can get cooked in the late summer. These fish that are so dependent on cold oxygenated water. What's the benefit to them to staying in the river an extra year?
Well, I think, this is something we learned in 2014 during the first drought. I think everybody always knows that is a strategy that fish use, but more commonly they're a year. Just like you said, it makes sense to stay a year and go out. When we had the drought in 2014, a lot of the rivers didn't open up at the mouth at all. There was no rain until February. So we had basically a complete run failure. No fish could come back into the rivers, except for somewhere like the Noyo that was open. But the 10-mile river, Pudding Creek, the Navarro, I know the Albion's open, but the fish really couldn't get up very far at all. And so from that, we were like, wow, what's going to happen? We didn't have any adults return. There's not going to be any fish. And what we found in that drought year was also the smolts probably couldn't get out because of the closure, although I think that did end up opening at some point. But it was really a response to drought. And so it turned out to be a really fortunate thing, because instead of losing a whole year class, you had when we trapped the second year in these traps, we said, wow, we know we had no fish that returned. We shouldn't have had any fish going out if they just did the typical 1-year class. And we actually had a lot of fish that had retained and stayed a whole second year. So that's one benefit, is that when you have something happen like that, it would make sense, right? And if you think about that, I'm not I don't know if they know that, but if they don't grow enough, they'll stay another year. Like it's not a big benefit to go out into the ocean as really small fish. And so if they hadn't grown enough that prior year, and that could have been because of drought conditions or lack of food or whatever, I think they'll stay in freshwater another year. But you're right. I mean, they're weighing out some vulnerabilities there, staying in the river for another year. But I think when you have a complete system and a lot of good habitat, then they would be able to express all those different life histories. Like there could be that refugia in particular places that are perfectly fine for those fish to stay longer. I think it's a more common strategy for coho up in Alaska and in those areas. And it's probably because it's so cold, was so colder water, and they would stay longer. So yeah, it was a really interesting finding. Sometimes you learn a lot about your species when you do have a drought, because you can, the water's clear, you can see things, or like that, you exclude a whole adult return and find out that the fish stayed longer. So, and that's a really common one for steelhead. I mean, they'll stay. I don't know if it's that common for 3-year-old coho, but steelhead for sure will stay like a third year in freshwater.
Interesting. And they grow real slowly when they're in the rivers, and then just grow really fast in the ocean.
Yeah, but seems like they still. I mean, it's not true for, I think about Chinook salmon in the Central Valley. I mean, they fly out of the systems when they're really tiny, but in big numbers. So it's different for all the salmon. But here, yeah, it seems like they need to get to a certain size before they'll go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the? I guess I probably should stop asking questions, or we'll be here all night. I was just wondering if you know off the top of your head what the average mortality rate is in the river and then in the ocean. That might be a pretty difficult question to answer, maybe.
Yeah, but I did talk about how we can understand if it's marine, survival, or if it's marine conditions that are affecting our fish, or if it's freshwater. There were some. I don't probably have that number. I mean, I think it's a very small percentage of fish that actually come back from a single red. I think it's it might be like one fish, but there are times and years when freshwater survival is better than marine. The period, I think it was about the 2005 period, when marine conditions were really bad for salmon, and that really showed in the data. And so freshwater survival was better then. It seems like even with that big warm blob out there, maybe some of our fish are staying. There's been some cooler water along the coast, and it seems like marine conditions have been better in recent years.
Yeah, the last couple of years for sure.
Yeah, so that's been different. So yeah, I don't really, I guess I don't have that number off the top. I have a chart somewhere that kind of shows that, but
yeah, they got to be tiny. Yeah, a tiny fraction returns back to the river. I was just wondering if they mostly die in the rivers on the way out, or mostly in the ocean, or what the split is. It's a question to look up and find out later, I think.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. That was a really fascinating talk. And thanks, Linda, for joining in there on the Q&A. We've got a lot of Linda McElwee, for those of you who don't know, is doing a lot of watershed restoration work on the Navarro in particular, and has been for many years, right, Linda?
Getting that way now. Yeah, Sarah, I want to call you. I want to have another question around that. Seems like we got spawning on the main stem and in the Navarro, and very curious during these drought years how they adapt to the conditions.
There were coho on the upper Navarro this year. Yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah,
because I saw what it looked like up there last year. It was all dry, right? I mean, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, very.
They can move down, right? And maybe find some refugia down there, lower down, where the water's hopefully they'll still be watered in pools, unless we, get some kind of storm here. But
I know.
Good.
I know.
Anyway, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody, I don't, you can probably find those resources on your own, but I was just amazed at how many like new initiatives and different things that are happening with grants and funds that are out there right now. And I think that, you know, taking it, we can't always be reacting to these droughts like as it comes up and like, oh, what are we going to do this year? Like, it's really got to be this long-term planning, just like we do everything else. I mean, just try to work together to do that. So anyway, it seems like there's some opportunities, and I don't know that much about it, but I encourage people to look out. And I encourage anybody, if you ever want to, you know, call me or come on a survey or something, you know, let me know. And I can. Thanks for all your questions, because I feel like I always find out what I miss in these talks sometimes. So I hear them and improve next time.
Well, thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining us for this. Yeah. And for all the questions. It's great to have an engaged audience.
Wonderful. Really appreciate you hosting. So great.
Yeah, thanks. Good, everyone.
We're certainly happy to do it. This is a major part of what the Mendocino Coast Audubon Society does, and we really enjoy it. So big thanks to everybody that helps. This is, you know, Tara Fuller and Haley Ross have been pulling together the programs for us, and big thanks to them for finding these great speakers and these fascinating topics for us. We're really learning an awful lot about our ecosystems in a time of rapid ecological change. And,
a good way to put it.
Yeah. All right, thanks everybody. I think that about does it for tonight. We will see you again next month.
Great. Good night.
Thank you.
Also,